On a cold morning in the early spring of 1971, high above the relentless, open ocean of the Pacific, a single mistake nearly changed our understanding of reality. We trust our most experienced aviators to bring back clear intelligence. We trust them to navigate the most challenging skies, to follow protocol, and to always, without exception, report the truth. But what happens when that truth defies everything they have been trained to believe? This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel David H., a man who spent his life dedicated to the measured precision of military flight, only to have his foundational beliefs shattered thousands of feet above the sea. David H. was, by all accounts, the perfect pilot, disciplined, rational, and possessed of a calm focus that made him invaluable in the cockpit of a sophisticated, high-speed reconnaissance jet. He wasn't a dreamer, a theorist, or a romantic. He was a machine of precision, and that is why his report, filed in the deepest corners of the Air Force archives, remains so deeply unsettling. His mission that day was routine. A high-altitude photographic sweep over a remote, designated zone, the kind of flight he had done hundreds of times before. The jet he flew was a marvel of technology for its time, designed to operate in the thin air where the sky turns deep purple and the earth below curves away into shadow. Every system was redundant, every instrument calibrated to the finest degree. In this environment, you rely on the machine to tell you the truth, because the human eye can easily be tricked by the vastness and the light. He was 2 hours into the flight, maintaining a steady Mach number, when the first anomaly appeared. It wasn't a mechanical alarm, a shudder in the airframe, or anything physical that would concern a pilot. It was a slight, almost imperceptible blip on his radar screen, an energy return where there should have been nothing but empty sky. David glanced at the screen, then checked his location against the inertial navigation system. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. There were no other known aircraft in this restricted corridor, not commercial, not military, and certainly not local traffic. His first rational thought was, inevitably, equipment failure. Radar systems are complex. Sometimes a phantom return can be caused by a reflected signal from the jet's own wingtip, or even an extreme atmospheric ducting effect. He ran the quick diagnostic check, the one he had memorized through countless drills. The system came back green. The blip remained. It was small, stationary, and it shouldn't have been there. Now, you have to understand the mind of an experienced reconnaissance pilot. They are trained to dismiss distraction, but also to recognize a genuine threat. David H. continued on his course, keeping one eye on the screen. The energy source wasn't moving. It wasn't emitting any transponder codes. It was simply present. He contacted ground control, maintaining the tone of detached professionalism required of his rank. Control, this is Victor 19er. I have an unconfirmed stationary contact, bearing 045. Estimate 30 nautical miles. Requesting confirmation of clean airspace. The response was immediate and standard. Victor 19er, negative traffic. Airspace is clear. Do you require a vector change? David hesitated. To report an unidentified object and continue flying toward it without permission was a break in protocol. But to ignore a potential mid-air hazard, however small, was against every instinct he possessed. The blip was now closer, having never moved, yet his jet was rapidly closing the distance. He made the conscious decision to deviate. It was a small deviation, a slight banking turn that he didn't log immediately, claiming only a minor course correction due to unexpected turbulence. But at that moment, the mission became personal, and the routine flight became an investigation. Control, holding current heading. Stand by. As he moved closer, the single blip on the screen did something that defied the rules of radar physics. It started to expand. It wasn't growing closer in the traditional sense, maintaining the same distance range, but its signature was suddenly getting exponentially larger, becoming less a point and more a vast, impenetrable zone of energy return. The contact was no longer 30 miles away. It was 10. Then 5. David peered through the reinforced canopy, adjusting his gaze from the blue sky to the horizon line. And that is when he saw it. It wasn't a plane, or a cloud, or a weather event. It was a massive, seamless structure of blinding, pure white light, extending vertically from the curvature of the Earth into the blackness of space. It looked like a brilliant, incandescent curtain drawn across the sky, completely opaque. It was still miles away, but it was already flooding the cockpit with an unnatural, intense glare. The light had no source, no seams, no shadow. It was simply a vertical wall of luminescence. The rational pilot fought the sensory input. It must be optical illusion, atmospheric reflection. But the instruments were screaming. The proximity warning system was now blaring, a shrill, insistent noise that cut through the silence of the cockpit. The radar screen had completely saturated. The small blip was now a solid, white disk consuming the entire display. David H. knew, with a sudden, bone-deep certainty, that this was not equipment failure, not weather, and certainly not another aircraft. He grabbed the microphone, his voice tight but still controlled. Control, I have visual contact. Repeat, I have visual contact with the anomaly. It is a light source. Massive. I'm going in for confirmation. He banked the plane further, adjusting his flight path not to avoid it, but to fly directly toward it. It was the decision of a professional who believed his duty was to bring back data, no matter the cost. He was flying straight into the unknown. The instinct of any pilot facing a physical barrier, a mountain, a severe thunderstorm, even a dense fog bank, is to slow down, to prepare for impact or turbulence. But as Lieutenant Colonel David H. accelerated toward that towering curtain of white light, he felt compelled to do the opposite. He pushed the throttle forward. Why? Because the light didn't look dense. It looked impossible. It was a barrier made of pure illumination, and yet, his instruments were reading a massive physical obstruction. He had to know what would happen when matter met luminescence. As he closed the final mile, the intense glare inside the cockpit became overwhelming. David H. had to squint through the anti-glare shield, his eyes watering against the sheer force of the brightness. Every shadow in the cockpit was eliminated. The world outside the canopy was gone, replaced by a searing, monolithic white. This is where the objective reality of the flight began to disintegrate. The moment the nose of his jet punched through the visible plane of light, the physical control surfaces of the aircraft seemed to fail. It wasn't a mechanical seizure. It felt as if the air itself, the very medium that holds a jet aloft, had vanished. Imagine flying through a vacuum that somehow still manages to create violent, bone-jarring turbulence. The jet, which moments before had been a rigid, stable platform moving at incredible speed, began to tumble. The G-forces hit him, not in a sustained pressure, but in sharp, unpredictable jerks that rattled his helmet against the canopy frame. His communication with ground control deteriorated immediately. The airwaves filled with an abrasive static, a high-pitched electronic whine that drowned out the calm, professional voice of the controller who was desperately trying to get him to execute an emergency turn. Victor 19er, you are off course. Repeat, abort immediately. What is your status? David H. keyed his microphone, his hand shaking on the stick. Control, I am inside the light. Total instrument failure. Repeat, total instrument failure. He was shouting over the cacophony of the alarms and the static, but the sheer chaos inside the cockpit was only half the problem. The visual scene was now completely terrifying. Inside this wall of light, there was no sense of movement. There was no sky, no horizon, and no ground. It was an environment without up or down, without forward or backward. He was suspended in an infinite expanse of white light that seemed to actively consume his sense of balance and his concept of linear time. This phenomenon was attacking the very core of his pilot training. A pilot relies on three things: his instruments, his sight, and the feel of the aircraft through the control stick. David H. was losing all three simultaneously. The instruments, the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, the compass, were spinning wildly, needles dancing like mad things. The artificial horizon, the small, critical gauge that shows a pilot the relationship between his wings and the earth, had completely tumbled, locking into an impossible, useless angle. He was flying blind, deafened by the static, and physically slammed around inside a machine that was no longer responding to his commands. In this moment of extreme physical and sensory deprivation, the pilot had to fall back on sheer, unadulterated instinct. He fought the control stick, trying to force the plane into a stable attitude, knowing that if he lost too much airspeed in this violent environment, the jet would simply break apart. But then, something far more unsettling than physical turbulence occurred. The sound changed. The electronic static abruptly vanished, replaced by a profound, suffocating silence. The engine noise, the familiar, deafening roar of the jet's twin engines, was gone. He could no longer hear the rush of air over the canopy. It was as if sound itself had been pulled away, leaving him in a silent, white, tumultuous void. In that silence, the pilot felt a wave of crushing, debilitating disorientation. He had a sudden, profound impression that his aircraft was not moving through space, but that time itself was warping around the aircraft. He felt a sharp pressure behind his eyes, a sensation of immense acceleration followed by an equally immense, unnatural deceleration, all while the aircraft remained visually suspended in the light. He was conscious, fighting to breathe, trying to pull himself back to the reality of the cold, hard jet metal surrounding him. He looked down at his watch, a reliable, wind-up mechanical chronometer, and for a split second, he saw the second hand cease its movement. Frozen. Then, just as suddenly, the silence was broken. A tremendous, percussive thump, like a gigantic hand slamming against the airframe, and the familiar sound of rushing air and screaming jet engines flooded back into the cockpit. The violent turbulence instantly ceased. The jet snapped back into a stable attitude, seemingly on its own. David H. looked up. The canopy was clear. He was flying in a bright, blue sky. The impossible wall of light was gone. He was outside. He was flying straight and level, and the physical danger had passed. He checked his instruments. They had corrected themselves, showing a stable altitude and airspeed. Everything appeared normal. Except for one thing. The fuel gauge. He had been inside that chaotic environment for what felt like mere seconds, a minute at most. Yet, the gauge showed a fuel reserve consistent with at least 20 minutes of full-power flight. And on the dashboard, the small mission clock, which had been perfectly synchronized with ground control when he entered the light, now showed a time gap. A gaping, unexplainable hole in the mission log. David H. keyed the microphone, his voice now a raspy whisper. Control, this is Victor 19er. I am clear of the anomaly. Standing by for instructions. There was no immediate reply. Only the empty hiss of an open radio frequency. Something was very, very wrong. The radio silence lasted only moments, but to Lieutenant Colonel David H., alone high above the ocean, it felt like an eternity. When ground control finally responded, their tone was clipped, urgent, and deeply confused. Victor 19er, state your position and intentions. Your transmission was broken. We show a radar gap of 22 minutes on the scope. We thought we had lost you. 22 minutes. The number hit David H. like a physical blow. He had subjectively experienced less than 60 seconds of chaos inside that blinding white light. He had fought the controls for perhaps 40 seconds, felt the strange pressure, the sound vanishing, and then the sudden release. Yet, according to the tracking systems of the United States Air Force, his sophisticated aircraft, monitored by high-powered radar arrays, had simply ceased to exist for 22 minutes. He gave his status: aircraft stable, engine parameters normal, pilot shaken but operational. He was immediately ordered to abort the mission and return to base. The descent and landing were executed flawlessly, a testament to the pilot's ingrained professionalism. But as he taxied the jet into the designated hangar, the atmosphere on the ground was anything but routine. There was no casual debriefing, no routine paperwork. Instead, he found a small, tight group waiting for him, his commanding officer, the base flight surgeon, and a stern, immaculately dressed man in a civilian suit who David immediately recognized as an operative from a centralized investigation unit, the kind of men who handled matters of high classification and national security. The debriefing began almost immediately in a secure, soundproof room. This wasn't an inquiry into a mistake. It was an interrogation into an impossibility. The investigative team, let's call them the Grey Group, laid out the facts David H. could not argue with. They had the flight tape, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and the radar data. The CVR tape confirmed his final transmission, his shout of total instrument failure and the sound of static. Then, absolute silence. A clean tape for 22 minutes and 3 seconds, followed by his calm, collected voice reporting he was clear. The telemetry data from the jet was even more damning. It showed that during that 22-minute gap, the engine remained running, the auxiliary power unit stayed active, and the fuel flow meter, for all intents and purposes, simply stopped counting. Yet, when the instruments came back online, the total fuel reserves were consistent with having burned fuel for the full duration of the supposed disappearance. The logs and the gauges contradicted one another in a way that defied thermodynamic law. Colonel H., the Grey Group lead stated, his voice flat and devoid of judgment, "Your flight log suggests you flew straight, maintained stable altitude, and then rematerialized 22 minutes later, having burned the expected amount of fuel, but with zero record of engine consumption or navigation data for the missing period. Can you account for this anomaly?" David H., tired and still feeling the residual physical ache of the severe turbulence, looked the man in the eye. "Sir, I can only tell you what I experienced. I flew into what looked like a wall of pure, white light. I lost all flight control and communication. The time I was inside that light was subjective, maybe a minute at most. But I assure you, I was not flying straight and level. I was tumbling violently." This was the core conflict: subjective truth versus objective data. In the rigorous world of military aviation, the tape and the log win every time. But the contradiction here was profound. If the pilot's account was true, then the laws of physics failed. If the data was true, the pilot was either lying or experiencing a profound psychological breakdown. The flight surgeon was brought in to check David's physical state. The only abnormality found was a slight but measurable increase in radiation exposure on his uniform badge, an elevation that was unusual for a high-altitude jet flight, but not dangerous. The pilot's physical health, including his neurological state, was deemed sound. He was not fatigued. He was not hallucinating. The investigation pivoted, moving from disproving the pilot's story to explaining the mechanism of the plane's disappearance. The jet itself became the focus. Every wire, every black box, every inch of the fuselage was subjected to intense scrutiny. The mechanics found nothing. No melted wires, no sign of catastrophic electrical failure, no breach in the airframe. The jet, physically, was perfect. Yet, one tiny detail emerged that nobody could dismiss. Tucked into an inspection panel near the left wing root, where the airframe meets the primary control surface, a mechanic found a trace element, a dusting of a fine, silvery white metallic powder. It was analyzed immediately. The substance was later determined to be an isotope of magnesium, but not the stable, naturally occurring isotope common to Earth. It was an extremely rare, unstable variant. It was this single, compelling piece of physical evidence, a substance that shouldn't exist in that environment, that forced the Gray Group to classify the encounter not as a systems failure, but as an unexplained aerial phenomenon. David H. was told, quietly and firmly, that his mission was over. The official report would state the cause as undetermined, likely meteorological or atmospheric in origin, but the classified annex would hold the truth of the missing time and the strange silver dust. His name, and the details of his incredible 22 minutes, would be sealed away. The weight of this secrecy, however, was just beginning to settle on the pilot. He had survived the encounter, but he now faced a future where he carried a truth too colossal to share. Once Lieutenant Colonel David H. was grounded, reassigned to a desk job, his flight status suspended, the true, secret life of his encounter began. It moved from the cockpit to the filing cabinets, becoming a problem not for pilots, but for analysts. His experience was now a piece of paper, a classified annex to a broader, decades-long effort to understand aerial phenomena that defied conventional explanation. How many real-life mysteries are buried deep within government archives, hidden in plain sight? The file on Victor 19er was routed through specialized channels that led straight into the heart of the government's official inquiry into unexplained aerial phenomena, which, depending on the decade, was run under different names, perhaps the echoes of Project Blue Book or a similar, more secretive successor. These were the teams tasked with maintaining the strict line between public perception and internal reality. Publicly, the official line remained: most sightings are misidentifications, hoaxes, or meteorological in origin. Internally, files like David H.'s demanded serious attention. The core tension for the investigators was this: the pilot was experienced, the aircraft was state-of-the-art, and the data was contradictory. They could easily dismiss the visual account, but they could not dismiss the 22-minute radar gap and the analysis of the silvery white powder. The analysts launched a rigorous, systematic search for precedents. They scoured reports from the Second World War, the infamous Foo Fighters that tracked Allied aircraft over Europe and the Pacific. They reviewed countless Cold War-era radar incidents, the objects that moved at impossible speeds or defied G-forces. They were looking for any event that matched the key variables of Victor 19er, a blinding white light, a loss of sound time perception, and a measurable physical change to the aircraft. They found several unsettling parallels. One report, declassified decades later, described a Navy observer in 1953 whose plane suffered a momentary complete power failure while flying near a stationary cloud of intensely bright, featureless light. The subsequent technical debriefing found that the plane's internal chronometer had inexplicably gained 3 minutes. Not lost time, but gained it, a minor, but profound, violation of physics that echoed David H.'s experience. The investigative team methodically ruled out every known scientific explanation for David H.'s encounter. St. Elmo's fire? Ruled out. That phenomenon, while producing electrical corona, does not generate a radar return or stop engines. Ball lightning? Ruled out. That is a localized, short-lived electrical event, not a massive, vertical wall that saturates radar. Severe atmospheric distortion? Ruled out. While radio waves can be bent by temperature layers, no known weather condition can stop the passage of time on a clock or generate an unstable isotope of magnesium. The single greatest piece of evidence was that strange, silvery powder found near the wing root. Analysis concluded it was a complex metallic compound with an isotopic ratio that did not match natural terrestrial samples. In simple terms, whatever the aircraft flew through left behind a residue that should not exist on Earth. This confirmed the encounter was not merely optical or psychological, it was physical. Yet, the investigative team's primary directive was to contain the story. A highly decorated pilot reporting contact with an unknown physical phenomenon that could manipulate time and leave behind non-terrestrial elements was not a story that could be released to the American public. It would undermine faith in military superiority and national security. The official resolution for the public record remained consistent: atmospheric anomaly. Pilot cleared of any fault. Case closed. For David H., the cost was immediate and enduring. He wasn't penalized, but he was permanently marginalized. His reports, his testimony, and his reputation, the very things that had made him the ideal pilot, were now a liability. He was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement of the highest classification. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that the truth of the 22 minutes, the light, and the silvery powder was not his to tell. He had fulfilled his duty. He had gone into the unknown and brought back the data. But the price of that data was his career, his voice, and a lifetime of knowing a truth that the world was not ready to hear. His experience had moved beyond military intelligence and into the realm of profound existential mystery. Lieutenant Colonel David H. left the service quietly a few years after the incident. He was given a respectable retirement, a gold watch, and a perpetual silence. He went on to lead a life that was deliberately unremarkable: a quiet house, a routine job in the private sector, and a family he adored. But he was no longer the man who loved the rigid precision of the sky. He was a man forever marked by an encounter that lasted less than a minute but took away 22 minutes of measured time. His story became a hidden artifact, known only to a few analysts in secured buildings. He never sought fame, he sought only validation. But validation meant challenging the foundational physics the government relied upon, and for that, he was permanently muted. Imagine the psychological toll of being a witness to the unexplainable. David H. knew what happened. He felt the cold shock of the sound disappearing, the violent tumbling of his jet, and the terrifying disorientation of the lost time. Yet, every day for the rest of his life, he was forced to behave as if the most profound, reality-shattering event of his career was simply a bad day at the office. This forced silence is the true tragedy of the Victor 19 file. It wasn't just about covering up an aerial anomaly. It was about sacrificing the credibility of an honest, professional man to maintain institutional order. David H. became a living ghost, a repository of a secret truth that could never be shared. But as the decades passed, the narrative around the unexplained began to shift. The very systems that marginalized David H. started to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence. The rise of sophisticated civilian cameras, the relentless accumulation of radar data, and, finally, the unprecedented decision by the US government to formally acknowledge unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP, as a legitimate concern. The stories emerging today, the high-resolution videos, the detailed radar tracks from Navy pilots, they are all echoes of that harrowing morning in 1971. When you hear modern pilots describe phenomena that defy conventional aerodynamics, objects that accelerate instantly, stop on a dime, or appear to utilize propulsion systems entirely foreign to our technology, you are listening to the same bewildered, professional voice of David H. from 50 years ago. He was the precursor, the historical standard by which we measure the current wave of reports. With the passage of time, the file on Victor 19, though still officially classified, has taken on a new significance. It stands as a testament not just to an aerial mystery, but to the incredible human capacity to survive the unknown and report it honestly, even when facing professional annihilation. What did David H. fly into? Was it a momentary, localized tear in the fabric of space-time, created by some unknown force? Did the dense energy of the bright wall of light somehow create a localized time warp, allowing his jet to exit the anomaly minutes after entering, yet still burning the expected amount of fuel due to the immense energetic demands of the warp itself? We may never know for certain. But decades later, with all the technology in the world, this one pilot's report still stands as an unshakable testament to the unknown. The silvery white powder is long gone, perhaps disintegrated or locked away in some forgotten vault, but the chilling testimony of the lost 22 minutes remains. David H. never saw a monster or an alien. He saw a physical impossibility, a wall of light that stole time and left behind a substance that was not of this earth. He saw the edge of reality, and he came back to tell us about it. His story challenges us to see the sky not as the ceiling of our reality, but as the infinite membrane separating the known from the utterly inexplicable. The pilot who flew into a bright wall of light reminded us that the vast, open skies we fly through every day still hold secrets potent enough to redefine the world. We are not just explorers of the earth. We are still merely observers at the fringes of a universe we barely understand.